in the room, because I'm sure I will miss one of you if you guys, and we'll recognize one in a few minutes, but if we do have any other elected officials in the room, if you all could please stand and be recognized as well. None? No? Okay. Okay. So in other words, I will recognize Senator Brad Overcash and Speaker of the House Tim Moore. I'll be honest, if I asked that question last week, there would have been about 30 people standing up, so I can make that comment, but it is post-election season now. I do want to recognize our sponsors that put all this together and make sure this is happening. First of all, our presenting sponsor, CaroMont Health, our independent hospital, Chris Peak. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your support. We're looking forward to a big ribbon cutting here in 2024 and appreciate all you all have done. Our signature sponsors today include Duke Energy. We're here. Thank you, Duke. ICS and First Horizon, who's also an Economist sponsor today. And you're going to hear a little bit from them. We would like to start, though, with our invocation. I'm going to ask Pastor Joe Bell of Eastside Church of the Nazarene to say a few words.
Good morning. Good morning. Let's begin our day as we should. Oh Lord God, you have brought many different people with different giftings and skills, with experience and education to this place. We believe that you bring us places that would help us to grow closer to you and each other and to do your work in this world. And we ask that you would open our minds and open our hearts so that we would not only hear what's going on and the expectations for the future, but that we would see with your eyes the people and things we can change for this world. Let this be a time when we meet with each other and meet with you, that we might be more like you when we leave. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen. And now, I think that's coming up.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate you doing that on the fly. You should do that for a living. So, welcome everybody. I'm Pat Mumford with the GBA, and I'm not sure there's any topic more critical to business than understanding the crazy economy, so that's probably why this room is full. And I'm super excited about Sophia coming back into town. I've heard her speak before. She's incredibly wise and insightful on the economy. I think you're really going to enjoy her comments. But just to bring it back to North Carolina for 2 years running has been the best place for business. And that doesn't happen by chance. And we're really honored today to have Speaker Tim Moore and Senator Brad Overcash here, and they'd like to say just a few words to set the tone. Sophia's going to talk about probably macro issues, and it's important to understand what the dynamic is here in North Carolina. And these two gentlemen, along with their colleagues in Raleigh, have worked really hard over the last 10 years to position this state as to be competitive, and we're super appreciative of all their help. So, Speaker Moore and Senator Overcash, take it away.
Good morning. It's good to be with you. I'm Tim Moore. I represent Cleveland and Rutherford counties in the House, but as the Speaker, I kind of get I get to cover all 100 counties, frankly. But Gaston County is close to home, is right next door. I live just across the line in Kings Mountain, been there my whole life. And I'm going to tell you, we've got a great legislative delegation. Brad is a new member of the Senate, is doing an amazing job for this region and has really been very effective for Gaston County, and a couple things I'll mention. Also, Senator Alexander, I know since his regrets, I do Representative Hastings, Representative Loftus, and Representative Corbett, who all had other engagements today. But I want to tell you a couple things that this team was able to help do this year for Gaston County. Anybody ever sat in traffic at 485 and 85? All right. I don't even need to pull the map up and show that one, right? One of the things very proud of that we were able to do this year was to get the funds to finally fix that ridiculous interchange that funnels all that traffic into like one lane. And that is it's something that we've all seen, we've all dealt with. That one, I think, Dr. Hoosier's doing over the community college. We're able to bring in at least $60 million for the new Allied Health Sciences building. And of course, Mr. Peak and everybody at CaroMont, what you all are doing at the hospital is incredible. I just want to say that at the state level, we've tried to create an environment of low tax, reducing regulations, and spurring economic development. How much money came to Gaston County this year total through state grants?
Over $180 million.
It's the most that's ever come to Gaston County. And matter of fact, Gaston County got the most of any state in this county. How'd you guys get more in Cleveland? That just doesn't say. Got more than any county in the state, but it's not because of patronage, it's because of the needs and the merits and the fact that this community is growing so well, and you've got such great local leadership here, not just elected folks, but those of you in the business community who are helping make things happen here. So what we want to do at the state level is be helpful anytime we can. I want to just give a shout out to what you guys are doing, Pat, at the GBA, getting so many good quality folks together at one time to make policy decisions. Please let me know anytime I can be of service to you. I know the rest of our colleagues as well, but you got to hear from this guy. I think one day he's going to be governor of the state. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and folks, I won't delay the true experts from getting up here, but to piggyback on what the speaker said, no matter what we hear, good, bad, or mixed about our economic forecast, one of the things that we focused on at the state level is having a robust rainy day fund. So in the event, and if and when we have a downturn, North Carolina will be well positioned. We've also tied our tax cut program to revenue triggers so that we can keep pushing down the corporate and personal income taxes, but do it in a responsible way. So we're here to help as much as we can, but we know that the folks in this room are the ones that drive the economy, and state government needs to get out of the way as much as possible. Thanks a lot.
Well, that was great. That was a great tee up for why all this is important to North Carolina. And thank both of you gentlemen and your colleagues again. You work long hours up there, and often it's rather thankless, but we're here to thank you. Next up is John Forgan. John is the regional area president for First Horizon, something like that. Sorry, John. The banker, it'll change next week. So thank you. John's also a board member. Going to be a board member incoming next year for the GBA. He's been a past board member and a great supporter of our organization. And First Horizon is sponsoring the economic presentation you can hear today, and the Economist, Sophia. So John, if you could come up and introduce Sophia, and then we'll get rolling into why you all are here.
Good morning, everybody. How's everyone doing this morning? It's a great day in Gaston County, right? Excited to be here today. There's so much change going around in Gaston County and in the region. Lots of growth, lots of great stuff. We had the fortunate opportunity to sponsor this event, sponsor the speaker this year, and have Sophia come in. A few of you have seen her at some other private events that we've had in the past. So, but anecdotally, talked to Sophia. Just when she was coming in this morning, she goes, yeah, I said, did you come in from uptown last night? And she said, no, I stayed at this cool boutique hotel. And I said, well, where? She goes, in Gastonia. And she goes, it's called the Esquire, have you heard of it? And I said, yeah, I've heard of it. So it was pretty cool, and it was really cool. And I said, would you get around to it? Well, I've only been here 8 hours. So I didn't get around to it, but there's a lot of building going on around here. There's a lot of stuff going on. As I was coming in, it's really cool to see all this growth. And there's a lot of, and I said, well, turn around. We were at the parking garage. I said, well, there's a building going up behind us that wasn't here last time you were here. So really, really cool. But so, First Horizon has been in the markets for a long time. We've been around since 1864, right? So it's been a long time. We're good balance sheet, strong bank, good regional bank in the market, with the really focus on clients, community, and commercial business here in the markets. And we live and breathe the markets every day. We try to get our teams involved in the community, invest in the community. It's nuts and bolts doing it the old way, right? Just go, you got to be here. You got to be present. You got to show up, right? It's the 1% thing, just show up, right? So with that, I'm going to introduce Sophia. So Sophia flew in last night, straight out of New York, actually straight out of Brooklyn, right? So she came in, so she's a Brooklyn girl, and this looks very similar to New York, right? Your office is in Manhattan, right? But She's our senior economist here through FHN Financial. She provides regular economic updates and presentations for our bank, which is the parent company of FHN Financial. She served as a senior business analyst, global commercial services with American Express for a number of years. Prior to her tenure at Amex, Sophia trained as an economic analyst with our FHN Financial Group for about 3 years. Sophia graduated magna cum laude from Washington and Lee University with a BA in economics and Spanish. So if you want to ask some questions, feel free. Okay. And Sophia was born and raised and currently lives in New York City. So with that, please give Sophia a round of applause.
Okay. Oh, clicker, very important. How's everyone doing for the 4th time this morning? Good? Great. I am super excited to be here. I'm Sophia. I've decided to kind of like share, right? I have a very long last name. I have 2 last names. So I'm just gonna go by Sophia. And Cher and I actually have the same birthday, so it feels like it's meant to be, right? So if you take one thing away, remember that you saw the Economist that's like Cher. But super, super excited to be here. As everyone has mentioned a little bit, I'm going the wrong way. Tech is not my strong suit, clearly. The economy hopefully is. But as everyone has mentioned in the last 5 minutes, there is a lot going on in the economy, right? So I came back into this role in the end of 2020, and so it's been a roller coaster of 3 years, right? Trying to forecast, trying to figure out. I'm sure everyone in this room has experienced the exact same things. And so I'm sure you're all super excited to see that the title of the presentation is Uncertainty Reigns. Don't have the crystal ball, but hopefully gonna give you some answers, leave you with some of the right questions. And because all of it right now is coming down to how did we get where we are, right? And where we are really being how the Fed has raised interest rates so quickly. And so before we dive into all of that, I had to do this a couple of months ago, right? We're in the midst of this rapid Fed tightening. You can see the top of this chart is the Fed funds rate. You can see we're not at the highest level we've been on the Fed funds, but this was the fastest tightening in history, or modern history. And so I recently, last couple months, had to pull back myself and go, wait a second, why, right? Because even us economists sometimes get lost in sort of all of the data that we're looking at. And so I started to think about okay, why has the Fed raised interest rates and what's the point and what are we trying to see in the economy? And it comes down to this very, very simple policy vision, right? Why is the Fed increasing interest rates? Well, it's in reaction to inflation. Hopefully everyone in this room knows that a little bit, right? We have been in the highest inflationary period that we've been in decades, right? Since the mid-'80s. It's really the first time in recent modern history that we have dealt with any inflation, right? Pre-pandemic, the Fed was trying to get inflation in the economy. And so in reaction to inflation, what does the Fed do? Interest rates is their main monetary policy tool, right? So they raise interest rates. What does that do? It makes borrowing more expensive. It's supposed to pull demand out of the economy, which is supposed to translate into slower GDP growth. When you see demand slow, you should also see labor demand slow, which should increase the unemployment rate a little bit. And then as you see the unemployment rate rise, that pulls inflation down as well. If inflation goes too far in the other direction, the Fed can go the other way with interest rates. And so this is the model under which forecasters have been working, under which the Fed's been working, right? At heart, the Fed is a group of economists and PhD economists and lawyers, and we all love data and models and history. And sort of like everything, though, that we've seen in the last 3 years, this cycle is why the uncertainty reigns, because this cycle hasn't worked the same way as many people expected, right? 525 basis points of tightening hasn't done what many people, including the Fed, expected. And the first piece it hasn't done, and this is, right, it's like a double-edged sword, it hasn't slowed the economy, which you would think is, well, that's great, right? We're talking about, we love economic growth, right? North Carolina, booming, a lot of construction. It is good, but for a Fed that's trying to slow the economy, we've largely seen the opposite. So what do we have here? This is your real GDP. If you took Econ 101, or you just like Econ and you studied it, this is your C plus I plus NX plus G equals GDP, right? It's your stacked contribution. And then the line with the dot is if you read market news and you hear GDP grew 4.9%, it's 4.9% annualized quarter over quarter, which is what we saw in the third quarter. The time period, incredibly intentional. Q1 of 2022, in March of 2022, the Fed lifted off the zero lower bound, right? That was the first rate hike. So this is a picture of growth, the exact period over which the Fed's been tightening. And again, it wasn't just our normal run-of-the-mill 25 basis points, right? It was 25, 50, 75, 75, 75, 75, 50, 25. And what did we see with growth? First 2 quarters of 2022, there were a lot of concerns about recession, right? There is a common myth, if I was Econ Mythbusters 101, this I think would be my first, let's say, podcast episode, right? Because everyone does a podcast now. It would be to break this myth that 2 negative quarters of GDP growth is a recession. Not true. 2 negative quarters of GDP growth is often a recession, but a recession is defined by a much wider slew of data and indicators. And we actually didn't see anything beyond those 2 quarters, right? We saw a rebound in growth, again, at the time that the Fed is still going at that faster pace. Those 2 quarters, that was fiscal drag actually from 2021, right? So then everyone lost concern about that. We had strong growth at the end of 2022. Coming into this year, we're coming off of that rapid Fed tightening, a lot of recession calls coming into 2023, right? I'm sure many people remember this. It feels like a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago, right? Everyone comes back from the holidays, you check in, you start to think, what's the forecast? There were some orange flashing signs, mainly because if we look at Q4, consumption had slowed a little bit at the end of that year. Then we got the January data, then we got the February data, and the March data. And what we have seen since, as you can see in 2023, is a remarkably resilient economy, right? We have seen the economy continue to chug along. Just about 2% growth in the first half of the year, and then really the big shock was that third quarter growth, right? We saw much stronger than expected growth. And again, this is when the Fed's already reached that 5.5% top on the Fed funds rate. So what has driven growth? We're gonna dive very deep into consumption. Why? Because the way the consumer spends is the way this economy grows. But before we do that, I wanna talk about 2 things, and the first is that green, which is business fixed investment. You will notice that until the third quarter of this year, business fixed investment was a positive, right? That's business spending. Some of that, particularly that big growth that you saw this year, is actually tied to fiscal stimulus. It's the CHIPS Act, it's the Inflation Reduction Act, and that likely is going to continue into next year, right? We're gonna continue to see some stimulus in the form of business fixed investment. And then the other one I wanna dive into deeply is residential investment, right? It's that sort of brighter blue. Now, residential investment until the third quarter of 2023 was subtracting from growth, which is actually what it was supposed to do, right? Where you see the most reaction to higher interest rates, normally first in the housing market. But what do you notice about the third quarter of 2023? Again, we actually saw a positive contribution from residential investment. And so I want to dive a little bit into the housing market before we get into consumer spending, because again, I think it's a great indication of the things have gone different this cycle, right? If there's one thing you should also remember about me besides the share, it's that I'm going to put multiple charts on the slide. I think it's my boss's least favorite thing about me. She's like, why'd you send me 28 charts? I was like, well, it's 6 slides. But I just, love data. If anyone else loves data, let me know. And I just feel like sometimes you gotta see the whole picture together, right? And the housing market's really one of those. Why? Here's what we're looking at. Top left, new and existing home sales. Existing home sales on the left-hand side, new home sales on the right. Existing homes are obviously the bulk of the housing market, right? That's where you have the most supply. Below that, you have the Zillow.com home value index in red, and then the dotted line is the observed rent index. And then that big chart on the right-hand side is your mortgage rates chart. On that chart, the blue line is your average 30-year mortgage rate. People are probably aware that we have seen quite a rise in mortgage rates, not only over the period the Fed's been tightening, but particularly in the last couple of months, right? We touched almost 8% on some measures for the average 30-year mortgage rate. We have seen that come down a little bit in the last couple of weeks, but the average 30-year mortgage rate is quite high. What's the red line? It's the mortgage rate of mortgages out there in the market, right? Because yes, the average 30-year mortgage rate, if you went out right now to buy a house, is almost 8%, but a lot of people got mortgages when? 2019, 2020, 2021, before the Fed started raising rates. And so the effective mortgage rate is actually still below 4%. And so one of the big questions that I think the Fed is asking, and markets are asking, and economists are asking right now is the economy less interest rate sensitive this cycle? And is that why that policy wheel hasn't worked the way we all expected? And the housing market, again, this sort of shift that you're seeing, the difference between the actual 30-year mortgage rate and the effective mortgage rate, I think is a good example, right? People are pulling out of the housing market, right? You notice the decline in home sales, both new and existing, right? People are pulling out because interest rates are high. But there are still some people taking on mortgages, right? Look at the difference between new and existing home sales. What do you notice? Existing home sales have continued to fall. New home sales have actually risen, even as you've seen higher mortgage rates. Why? Because there's unmet demand, right? There is still people in the house. Well, first of all, housing is something you always have to buy, but there's still people that in the last couple of years couldn't get a house, and because people in the existing home sales market are not trying to get an 8% mortgage if you locked in a 2.25 like my colleague. I was like, do you want to share that with me? She was like, we can't do that. People aren't, right? If you have a 3% mortgage, you going out to get a new house right now? Anyone in this room? Great. I was like, if someone raised, I saw one hand. Listen, if you have to buy a house right now, you're gonna get an 8%. But if you don't have to, you're not listing it. So what is that? It's low inventory. What does that do? Pushes people into the new housing market, right? So you have that run up of new home sales. I'm sure you guys are seeing it here in the Charlotte surrounding area, right? There's a lot of construction and there's a lot of housing need. What is the sort of policy piece there? Inflation's not coming down in the housing market, right? You look at home prices, they've actually ticked up a little bit. They're not rising to the same extent that they were, but they're not pulling demand out enough in the housing market to see home prices start to come down. And so that's, again, one of those examples of that policy wheel that you would expect to see work that you're seeing a little bit differently. I do think we're going to continue to see more of a flat line in housing than necessarily any more rise. Why? Because there is a lot of new inventory coming into market. That being said, construction costs are still high, and so they're going to keep pressure, I think, on those new home sales coming into market. And so I don't expect that we're going to see a big decline in house prices. I think if anything, heading into next year, you're going to see more of that flat line that we saw at the beginning of this year, where you're not seeing a rise like we were in 2022 of 25%, but you're seeing something more roughly in line with the 2.5% to 5% increase in home prices. So what about the rest of consumer spending, right? The way the consumer spends is the way this economy grows. The biggest part of that surprise Q3 growth was consumer spending. Where are consumers spending right now? Services, right? The service side of the economy is absolutely driving the growth that we're seeing. So the chart that you have here, real and nominal. Nominal spending in blue on both charts just means the actual dollar amount. Real means it's your inflation adjusted. On the left-hand side, you have goods. On the right-hand side, you have services. You'll notice, obviously, we had a big switch from services to goods in 2020 and 2021. That was when people couldn't spend on services. It was the Peloton bikes and the lawn furnitures and the standing desk that I needed. And then we saw people switch in the other direction. But it took a little bit longer before we really saw that trade-off. But now we are really seeing the service side of the economy growing. And a lot of it is some pent-up demand. Some of it is just people really want to still spend on these services they couldn't spend on. It's the Taylor Swift economy, I say, right? That is what we saw this summer. Taylor Swift and Beyonce, right? Taylor Swift became a billionaire because good luck getting tickets and who knows how much they cost, but people bought them, right? People wanted them. We were just talking, I have not been in an empty airport in forever. I was in Charlotte at 10 p.m. last night, mobbed. I was like, where's everyone going, right? I haven't been on an empty plane. I get those notifications all the time. Are you willing to give up your seat? We'll give you $1,000. I have yet to have an opportunity to actually take one of those, but I'm always tempted. But you're seeing through this summer, that was what we were seeing, right? There was just this sort of big service spend. People took vacations that they wanted to take that they hadn't taken. And it was a little bit, to be honest, longer than I expected this pent-up demand to be there, right? Because the service side of the economy, even in the Northeast, had been open for almost 2 years, right? But the lingering impacts, I think, of what we experienced in 2020 are much longer than we would have expected. And so that's really what we see. You see that growth that we see there in the red line on the real services consumption. But I will call out goods consumption in the third quarter did rise. What was some of that? It was auto spending was one of the big ones, and that is also some pent-up demand, right? There are finally new cars for people to buy. So people always ask, how are consumers still spending, right? Because it's not like things are cheaper, right? Everyone notices price increases. Your grocery bill, your heating bill, sometimes when you fill up your tank at the gas station, not me, I don't drive. How are people doing this? One way is they are taking on more debt, right? We have seen an increase in credit card debt in particular. So what are we looking at here? This is the New York Fed Household Debt and Credit Quarterly Survey. We just got the third quarter data, and you'll notice across the board on the left-hand side are the 4 types of debt, household debt: auto, credit card, student loan, and mortgages. Mortgages on their own axis because they're so big in relation. What do you notice across the board? Every level of debt has really been rising, right? Mortgages, you'll notice, which is that slightly gray line, sort of flat line, and then look at that tick up, right? That was what we just talked about in the housing market, that people are still taking on some mortgages, much slower, obviously, very, very slow growth there in the mortgage market. Student loans pretty much flat. Autos, you'll notice, have continued to climb. This is not inflation adjusted, this is nominal, so it doesn't necessarily mean more cars, but it means expensive cars still being bought. So we've continued to see that. And then credit card debt is the really big one this year that we have seen a big increase in, right? That red line you'll see, credit card debt actually fell off in the pandemic, started to, as people paid off debts, had stimulus, people were saving more, started to rise, and then you'll notice the last couple of quarters has risen quite notably, above $1 trillion outstanding of credit card debt. That flat line as well, this is like such a nitty-gritty point, but as a data person, that flat line you see, normally debt falls in the first quarter. It didn't fall in the first quarter, which to me was a sign of that strong consumer spending growth that we continue to see. The question always when you're looking at debt is, are we worried? Is it nervous debt, right? Is there stress? And we're starting to see a little bit of stress in some of that credit card debt. So this is your new delinquent loan balances. So that is your percent of balances that are newly delinquent fees in the last 30 days. Everyone is always very concerned about mortgage debt, right? Obviously after what happened in the great financial crisis, you'll notice mortgage new delinquency is still very low, right? The housing market that we are in right now and the mortgage situation is not at all what we were in the GFC. So that's good. Student loans, we're gonna talk about more, but delinquencies are very low. Not because no one's delinquent, but because there's been a moratorium and that won't be reported until the fourth quarter when people are behind, or if people are behind until 2024. The other 2 levels, credit card and auto, right? That is where we've seen the biggest increase. And in the third quarter, we did see that red line, you'll notice, of credit card newly delinquent loans tick up above its pre-pandemic level a little bit. Not necessarily yet very, very worrying, but it is a sign that you are starting to see some stress on households from that really high level of consumer spending and consumption that they've taken on. So it's something we're gonna be watching. The age group that the New York Fed identified as having the most stress is the 30 to 39, the millennials. And I have to think that some of that is probably because those people also took on probably housing debt, right? So they have a mortgage maybe that they took on, they might have student loans, and so that's one thing to always remember is no type of debt exists in a bubble. The student loan one is a big question mark for 2024. It's not gonna be a big windfall slowdown in consumption growth, but I do think it's gonna have a year-long sort of impact as households readjust their budgets. There's so much uncertainty as to what's due when, and the income-driven payment plans don't start till next year. And so I think that that's something that's gonna be sort of something that restrains consumption, but not till probably the first or second quarter of next year. One of the other reasons though that we've seen this sort of insatiable demand from consumers has to do with the fact, that we have had a really tight labor market, right? And that keeps consumer spending. We did see a slowdown in hiring in October. So this is your non-farm payrolls monthly change, broken out by the sectors. If you look at the October mean in relation to September, quite a slowdown. However, there was some UAW strike impact, which is obviously passed. And so if we adjusted out for that, we would have had about 180 or closer to 200,000 jobs added, we think. It's too soon to say that the October slowdown was a big slowdown, particularly when you look at that 12-month average, right? We've seen a little bit of bounciness in hiring, but 12-month average of around 350,000 is much too high for a Fed that's looking for more of 150,000 average job gains. Now, this is a good thing that we've seen this hiring on one side, right? Because the number one thing that I've heard from people in the last year and a half is, I cannot find workers, right? There has been such a difficulty hiring, and so actually seeing some of that strength that we saw in September and in July is a sign that there are more workers around to be hired, and that's true. We've actually seen quite an increase in the labor supply in the last couple of months. Immigration is back to its pre-pandemic levels, which is a good thing because one of the biggest issues we were facing in the last 2 years was that labor demand was exceeding labor supply by so much. But this is still too strong hiring again for that Fed that's looking for some of the slowdown. The unemployment rate did rise to 3.9% in October. Again, some strike influence there. We were at 3.8 before that, which is above where it's been for the last couple of months, but is still really, really low historically. A 3.8 unemployment rate is a very low one. And so one of the results of what we've seen in that tightness, some of the tightness in the labor market coming out, is we have seen improvement in wage pressures, right? And this is both, there's this big, if you follow economics, one of the biggest concerns when you come to inflation is the dreaded wage price spiral, right? That wages are being the big driver of inflation. The Fed has assured us we're not in that, but it doesn't mean that wages aren't having an impact, right? One of the ways that they've had an impact is that strong wage growth keeps consumer spending, right? When you feel confident that you have income coming in, you feel confident taking on debt, continuing to spend. We have seen some of that slowdown in the labor market reflected in wage growth. So year over year, average hourly earnings at 4% in October is quite an improvement from the 6% that we saw at the peak, but it is still above the around 3% level that we were at pre-pandemic, and that's more consistent with an economy at 2% inflation. Think about it, what is the sort of generic cost of living raise? 2.5%, 3%, 4% is higher. And this is something, the background of this chart is the actual dollar average earnings amount, right? Because we look at year over year a lot, and it is important, but the dollar amount is also really important because when you're coming off of higher growth, you're still growing 4% off of that higher level. And this is the biggest switch I've heard from people in the last couple of months. It's that I can find people, but my labor costs are still higher than they used to be, right? My 4% maybe annual raise I'm giving people is much higher than the 2.5%. And so that is still adding some price pressures. And when we look at inflation, which we will in the next slide, that is where you're still seeing some of those price pressures. But part of the, again, I mentioned this impact on the economy has really been that because you're seeing that strong average hourly earnings growth in the tight labor market, you've actually seen real incomes growing as well this year. And again, this is in some ways a good thing, right? Real income growth means that that red line, which is inflation adjusted, means that households are gaining wealth, but it also is part of what's kept people spending, right? They're not necessarily just spending out of credit, they're not necessarily just spending out of savings, but they're also spending out of their earned real income. In 21 and 2022, you'll notice that red line fell. Inflation eroded a lot of real purchasing power for households, but both because of the combination of the tight labor market that we saw, so that 4%, and the fact that we've seen inflation come down is why you've seen real income growth this year. So now what about inflation? Inflation is obviously the reason the Fed started tightening, and the reason why, we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, the Fed's not sure they're done yet either. We have seen notable improvement in inflation. You might not notice it in your budgets or at home, and I'll talk about why. It's largely because there's a big sort of disconnect, I think, between people, between the difference of deflation, which is negative inflation, and disinflation, which is just slowing inflation, right? So even if the Fed hits their 2% target, it's still going to be 2% off of a higher level, which means, if your oatmeal used to be $2.50 and then it went to $4, it's going to grow 2%. Well, hopefully not your oatmeal, but it would grow 2% off of that $4. It's not going back to being $2.50. But year over year, we have seen really notable improvement in inflation. So this is your CPI, which is your Consumer Price Index. It is one of two consumer inflation indices that we watch. This one used to be the secondary inflation index before we had inflation, and now it is the primary one we watch. Why? It comes out 2 weeks before the other one. When you're data hungry and inflation is the driver of policy decisions, the sooner you can get it, the more interested you are. So what have we seen? The stacked bar is the month-over-month contribution from different categories, right? So if you take that sort of a basket of goods when we talk about an inflation index and you break it down, you have core goods, core services, food, and energy. Core just means we took out food and energy. The line is the year-over-year change, right? And so you notice the year-over-year change peaked 9.1% in the middle of last year. That is why the Fed went from 25 to 50 to 475 basis points in a row, because they were tightening into this rising inflation. We have since come down at 3.7%, but the big driver of the run up and then the detractor that we saw in the last year really was energy costs, right? That red bar, you'll notice big gains in energy costs at the beginning of 2022 coincides directly with Russia's war in Ukraine beginning to run up in energy prices that we saw. As we saw energy prices come down and stabilize in the last year, that was where you saw a lot of that easy improvement in inflation, right? Last couple of months, energy added again, pulled that easy energy disinflation out, and that's why we're sort of flatlined at 3.7%. What is the big driver though of that inflation if you strip out those energy costs? It's core services, right? It's the service side of the economy. Why? That's where people are spending. And we think about wages, what's the biggest input cost for services? It's wages, right? So when you think about that 4% versus a 2%, that's where you're still seeing pressure. The other big driver of core services, and this is kind of a quirky one, is shelter costs. Housing is actually considered a service when you think about inflation. And so it falls into your core services. It's the shelter that your home provides you. You will notice that core service inflation month over month has actually been trending up and popped in September. Housing was the big jump, shelter was the big jump in that September. Comes back to what we talked about in the housing market, right? That lack of price pressures coming out. There has been no consistent downward momentum in that core services, and that is the stickiest, hardest part of inflation for the Fed. So we just looked at the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index. This is the PCE, which is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. When the Fed talks about their 2% inflation target, which if you're not familiar, the Fed has a congressional dual mandate of stable prices and full employment. Stable prices is defined as 2% on the core PCE. So when we say core again, we're just taking out food and energy. When we look at the core in relation to what we just looked at in the headline, which includes that energy, you don't see that same improvement that we've seen, right? Because you don't have that easy energy disinflation. So this is both the core and the solid line, and then something that we've started watching in the last year called the super core, which is PCE services, X energy, and shelter. So taking out the housing component, right? If we look at the other services in the economy. And what do you notice about both? They've come down, right? We've seen an improvement in core inflation without a doubt, but at nearly 4% on the core PCE, that is still almost, well, because it's not exactly 4, but double the Fed's 2% inflation target, right? And this is where the Fed is sort of at that uncertain place, right? Because they've seen improvement and you're looking at a downward trajectory, but it's the sustained momentum towards 2% that they're not sure they're gonna see yet. Why? Because those underlying pressures are really still in the service economy. And so it really comes down to the Fed. And also, if I need to be fast on time, someone let me know. Okay, great, got a thumbs up. I've learned about myself, I'm a long story long person. If I ever tell you long story short, I'm lying. But it's just, love chatting. And especially about the Fed, right? Who in here doesn't want to talk about the Fed all the time? My friend, I'm great at the cocktail party. Anyways, so what is the Fed, right? There's uncertainty. The Fed is on the fence, and it's largely, again, because of that inflation that we saw. So we had a Fed meeting last week. I've been on the road, so I'm like, was that last week? Yes, we had the November Fed meeting last week. And honestly, We didn't get what we call the dot plot or the summary of economic projections, so we just got a rate decision. The rate decision was no rate hike, so it was a second skip in a row. I use the word skip intentionally because it might be a pause, but there also might be another rate hike. And I say that because that's sort of what they said to us, right? That's what Powell said in his press conference was, we might be there, we might not. So all we really got, the bulk of this sort of meat of it was Powell's press conference. And this one quote, I think, from his prepared marks, so before he started answering questions, I think is really, really telling of this sort of question mark that the Fed is facing, right? And it's about why they made the decision they made. And so I'm gonna do some live annotations as I read this quote for you. Given how far we have come, we are aware we have tightened very quickly. Along with the uncertainties and risks we face, read geopolitical tensions, market interest rates, the state of the economy, the committee is proceeding carefully. We're not gonna raise rates this week. We will make decisions about the extent of additional policy firming. We might need to hike again, we're not really sure. And how long policy will remain restrictive, higher for longer, based on the totality of the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. So they basically told us, we're not sure, there's a lot of uncertainty, we're gonna be cautious, and why is that? It's because they're answering this question. It's not, is monetary policy restrictive, right? Because we know monetary policy is restrictive, we're gonna look at that. The Fed funds rate at 5.5% on the top end is above the inflation level, right? The question is it sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation back to 2%? And that's where the committee has not reached a decision yet, and why they're leaving us all in this uncertain place. This is not the first time, though, that in the last couple of months that we've known that the Fed's not really sure what the right level is, because they are assessing the data, they are looking at the evolving outlook, and they are aware of even risks outside of their control. This is the dot plot, which is, like the Super Bowl for economists every 4 times a year. It is the only thing we get from the Fed in what's called their summary of economic projections that has very clear individual forecasts, right? So it is all 17 members of the FOMC, whether they're voters or non-voters, submit projections for several different indicators, and then they submit their dots, right? And each dot represents one person's expectation for the Fed funds at the year end. The dots are anonymous until someone inevitably comes forward once this sort of the speaking ban is lifted and says, yep, I'm the highest one, I'm the lowest one, I agree with the median. But what do we see, right? In September, which was the last dot plot we got, which was 6 weeks ago? Not even. 12 individuals thought that there was one more 25 basis point hike in the calendar this year. We obviously did not get it last week, which means December would be the only meeting. There were seven individuals who thought we're done, right? So that's September, thinking about the end of the year, December. Their meeting is the middle of December. Obviously, a lot shifted, and we're going to talk about that between September and November, and so there's still more that could shift before December. But I want to talk about the later years too, right? Because we are thinking about 2024 and beyond. And this is where the biggest thing for me, always look at the range of the dots and not just the median, right? Because you'll notice the median there is boxed. The median expectation amongst Fed officials is 5.125, so 5.25% on the top end of the Fed funds rate, which would be a decrease from where we are currently, and if they go 25 basis points. But there are a range of opinions amongst the Fed officials as to what the appropriate policy stance is going to be in 2024. There is no consensus yet amongst Fed officials as to what they're going to do, honestly, I think, this year, let alone next year. And why? It really is because that policy cycle hasn't worked the way they really expected to. And so they're going to be, I think, a little bit more reactionary than anticipatory as we are heading into 2024. But the really other thing too important, if you are someone who follows this, and if you watch CNBC, for example, on Fed Day, and it's all about the dot plot, always remember it's a snapshot of a moment in time, right? It is not it's not a pledge from the Fed, it is not an official forecast. It is on those 2 days, they submit the forecast on Tuesday night and then they release them on Wednesday. It's a snapshot of what they thought in that moment of time, and it can change. And here's an example of how their snapshot has changed for other indicators as well. So along with the dot plot, we also get their projections for GDP, PCE, core PCE, unemployment. Here we're looking at GDP, unemployment, and core PCE, so what we call the big three, and then the Fed funds. This is an evolution of the Fed's forecast from March of 2022 when they lifted off the zero lower bound, December of 2022, so coming into this year after the rapid tightening, what did they expect for this year? And then most recently in September, what are they projecting for this year and next year? I do not include this to discredit the Fed's ability to forecast, right? It has been a tough time to get the forecast right. It does make me feel a little bit better, right? If the Fed sort of gets to readjust this much too, I think I can. But I use it just again as a reflection of things haven't gone the way even the Fed expected. So what do we look at in 2023? What I think is really interesting about this is we're almost on most indicators exactly where the Fed thought we would be, lifting off the zero lower bound, but with a much higher Fed funds rate, right? You'll notice the Fed funds median obviously has drifted is too light a word, shot up from where they thought they would be at the end of this year. Again, even the Fed did not expect they would tighten at the rapid pace they did. GDP growth 2.1%, even if we have a slowdown in the fourth quarter, and I do think we will see a little bit of a slowdown, we're not gonna see 4.9% growth like we did in the third quarter. We are on track to have a solid year. I think honestly closer to 2.5% in this year. Unemployment rate I mentioned, 3.9%, 3.8 is a very feasible unemployment rate for this year. The big shift in both 23 and 24 in Fed expectations for unemployment is that they don't think they need to see as big a rise in unemployment as they originally thought. And that actually is a big shift for Fed officials because the unemployment rate is a critical part of inflation models in economics and for Fed officials. And so even to see that decline to 4.1% in the median in 2024 suggests they think they don't need to see as much slowing in the labor market. Core PCE 3.7 at the end of this year. We might hit that. I think we're going to be a little bit above, but we could be there. And then next year, what are they looking at, right? Expectation for growth, 1.5% has been revised down. 1.5% still fairly solid growth. Honestly, a little bit probably just in line with potential, and the Fed is looking for a period of below potential growth. Unemployment rate 4.1, again, would be a rise, but not as much as they expected. Core PCE at 2.6%, close to 2, not 2. And what's the reaction to that is the expectation that rates will need to still be higher, right? Still be restrictive. And so I mentioned, when the Fed funds rate is above the inflation level, that is when we're having restrictive policy. So I mentioned that there were, right, the dot plot was in September. Obviously there were 12 people in September who thought there was going to be a rate hike. And I think some people maybe thought it would be at the November meeting. Between the September Fed meeting, which is the middle of September, and the November meeting last week, one of the biggest shifts that we saw in the markets that was reflected in what we heard from telegraphing ahead of the meeting from Fed officials was the rise in the long end of the curve, of the yield curve. So what are we looking at here? This is your US 10-year yield, a very, very long-term picture, and then a zoomed-in picture. You will notice we've broken out of the trend channel, the last sort of 40 years trend channel in terms of the rate increases that we've seen in the 10-year. And then the zoomed-in chart, that big increase between the last two dots, right? We saw a very fast increase from September to October in the 10-year yield. And it was driven by a host of factors, right? There's a lot of talk about what's the driver, right? Some of it was the Fed uncertainty. Some of it was markets responding to that. Some of it was market concern about the level of federal debt that we have. Some of it was just strange market fundamentals. Some of it was in reaction to, we had some sort of drops in reaction to geopolitics. But the run-up in the long end of the curve was one of the factors that caused everyone on the Fed, whether they were the most hawkish or the dovish, to go, we're probably going to skip in September. Why? Because effectively this does some tightening for the Fed, right? This is what we call tightening of financial conditions, right? When you see the long end of the curve increase, that also has an economic impact. The question still for the Fed is, when are we going to see the impact, right? What is the impact of this going to be? And so we have actually seen the 10-year yield come down a little bit after the Fed meeting. partially in response to the Fed. And there are some Fed officials, most notably Lori Logan of Dallas, who said, well, some of that increase might be actually because of the good data and because of how the market thinks we're going to react. And so it's almost like a chicken or an egg, right? The Fed doesn't usually react to market data. They do, but they drive market data. But we know that this is something they're going to be watching. Again, because they're at this, are we sufficiently restrictive question, and if the market tightens some for them, maybe they don't have to tighten as much. But one of the really biggest shifts, and we're almost at the end, I promise, one of the really sort of big shifts that we've experienced and we're seeing from the Fed is not the, are we gonna go 25 basis points or not, right? Because for the last year and a half, that's been the big question was, are they gonna raise at this meeting? I don't say this to be callous, but to some extent at this point, 25 basis points is a rounding error, right? I personally think December is still on the table, potentially. I think it will come down to what we see in the inflation data. But I also think we might be at the peak of the Fed funds rate, right? But looking beyond that, the question is now really, how long are rates going to be restrictive? And then beyond that, there's this big question starting to be asked of, is the neutral rate actually higher now? Have we seen an increase in the neutral rate? And it kind of comes back to that original question I said, we're looking at the housing market. That question of, is the economy less interest rate sensitive to some extent? And so the neutral rate, when you talk about the Fed funds, we often look at the real Fed funds rate, right? So the blue line is the actual, the red line is just the inflation adjusted, the real Fed funds rate. And the neutral rate, when you're talking about the neutral rate, is the rate, the Fed funds rate at which the policy is neither restrictive or expansionary, right? So it's often the rate at which the economy should settle at when we're at stable prices and full employment. We have been, in terms of real Fed funds, for the last 15, 20 years in a negative real Fed funds era. Why? Because we had very low interest rates and we also had low inflation. And so when we were subtracting inflation still, we were negative. The new normal that we were in for the last 15 years is actually the abnormal, right? And so we are now heading most likely into a period that's gonna look more like the old normal. And so one of the things that I've heard from a lot of people and I think is really important, and one of our customers said this recently, was the way we all grew in the last 15 years isn't going to be the way we all grow in the next 15 years. And why, maybe not 15, 5, why it really comes down to this idea that the Fed has started to suggest, and there are some Fed officials saying, we might actually be at a higher neutral rate. And so when we look at the longer run Fed projections from the dot plot, so the dots all the way to the right, that is what you typically think of as the neutral rate. The median has not moved, it is still 2.5%, and so if you think about a 2.5% Fed funds and a 2% inflation, that would put your real at 0.5%. But the range and central tendency have drifted higher, right? And you do have some Fed officials that are starting to ask the question. Powell was asked even a couple weeks ago, do you think neutral has risen? And his answer was, I don't know, but it could have, right? And so that is some of what we're starting to see, and that is some of the higher for longer messaging that we're getting from the Fed, right? Higher for longer does not necessarily mean higher interest rates in terms of we're gonna keep raising rates, but it means two things. It means they're gonna keep policy restrictive, so a higher interest rate relative to inflation, and it also means the potential that we might be looking at a higher neutral rate in the long run. The clicker might have stopped, but I can solve this problem. Hold on one second. Oh, hold on, it says reboot. I'm gonna say remind me in 60 minutes. Okay. Please hold. I only have one more slide. Oh, no. But you've all seen the disclaimer, right? Okay, perfect. Got it, thank you. Sorry, I am not in tech. Do not ask me to do anything IT related. Oh, no. Someone's favorite slide had to be that one. Okay, don't touch it. Okay, I'm talking really, really fast so I can cover board really fast. I already talk very, very fast, I know. So just a couple of key takeaways, key points to think about. Again, there are a lot of questions. A very good mentor of mine though, because I'm always like, I want to give everyone answers, right? Sometimes the best thing to know is to write that to me in terms of writing, to ask the right question. But there are a couple things we do know, right? Looking at just the economic data, the economy's been chugging along, right? GDP growth is pretty strong. Job growth is slowing, but honestly, still pretty healthy in the labor market, particularly strike adjusted for those October data. Inflation has improved, right? We've seen a moderation in inflation, but is still much too high. And again, particularly for households, right? People are now, after a year and a half, 2 years of inflation, really starting to feel the impacts because 4% growth off of 9% really hits your budget. So it's still too high. Fiscal policy is still very stimulative, which is kind of the counter to what the Fed's looking for. It is also likely to be, and I'm not going to get into politics, but likely to be next year. It is an election year, and it tends to be. Geopolitical risks are one of the biggest uncertainties, right? And you can't telegraph them. For us in the US, we are facing a couple that could be inflationary and deflationary. Inflationary, war in Ukraine, still a potential inflationary impact. The crisis in the Middle East also has a potential impact, particularly on oil prices. On the other side, situation in China, particularly what started in the housing market, has a potential to be deflationary. So we're looking at both sides of the coin there. And then when it comes to the Fed, they're not certain that they're not done or they're done yet. And so what does that mean? It means we are looking at a Fed that, again, is going to be reactionary, right? The one thing we have heard across the board from Fed officials is that they expect to keep policy restrictive for longer. So you have market expectations that expect the Fed to cut as soon as the middle of next year. We don't have our first rate cut in our forecast until the end of next year. Part of that has to do with that last bullet point. Just want to end on a happy note. Recession risk, right? Is it there? Is it a soft landing? Recession risk is highest probably late 2024, early 2025. I do expect, again, there are some headwinds for consumer spending next year. We are going to see the impacts, I think, of this rapid tightening, but there's so much uncertainty that we will be keeping everyone informed. And with that, I think we're doing a panel, and I'll answer questions then. Thank you all so much.
All right, well, thank you for all those non-answer answers. I can't imagine that anybody had an expectation we had it all figured out. But that was great context. So now what we'd like to do is bring some local leaders up for a panel discussion. Sophia's going to join them. Morgan's going to moderate this. And the idea here is to take all of this information and answer the question, so what? What does that mean to Gaston County? What does that mean to our businesses locally? What does it mean today and into the future, and how are we planning for that? So first up, Chris Peak. Where are you? Chris was right in front of me. So Chris, as likely all of you know, is our phenomenal leader of CaroMont Health here, based in Gaston County. Also, Angel Baez is going to come and join us. Angel is the plant director for Dole Fresh Vegetables in Bessemer City, a very large employer here in Gaston County. And then we're also going to have Faison Kuster come up. Faison leads Kuster Companies, a regional real estate commercial development company. So John, if you could come up, you guys can tell a little more about yourselves when John comes up. John, if you could come up and moderate this, and Sophia, please join the crew. And it looks like this is all the microphones, is that correct? All right, so y'all are gonna have to play nice and share.
All right, I did mine. All right. But thank you all for coming today and joining, and this is meant to be conversational. We will try not to, I told you I was gonna really give you some zingers, but I'm gonna try to get a few, put them on the spot, but there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in Gaston County. There's a lot going on in the region, as we've talked about. I'm going to do a little bit of round robin, a few direct questions, and maybe we can do some, just go from everyone, take a look. But specifically for Chris. Chris, I don't know there's such a big project going on in the region. There's so many things going on. You're such a large employer in the market. As you look legislatively, what do you see as policy shifts? What do you see out there that on the horizon that might impact CaroMont?
Fantastic, thanks, John. I know that we have a few things going on, really, large expansion in Cherville, so hopefully you guys can get up that way. That's not really the largest expansion maybe we have going on, but we do have a very nice partnership going on out at Bell and Abbey, and which has been an important part of reinvesting in this community and meeting the need. With regard to legislative activity, the beauty and the curse of any type of legislation in healthcare, much of the legislation that affects us is at the federal level, some at the state level. The good and the bad, gridlock is a real thing, and sometimes that's good, sometimes not so good. So healthcare legislative change is typically relatively slow. And so it is incumbent upon us to really continue to focus on meeting the needs of the community within the restrictions and or the boundaries that we're allowed to play in currently, with trying to anticipate what might be coming our way from both federal and from state. We've had some significant changes at the state level that actually impacts federal level with regard to access to care. Our state legislature passed an expansion which is allowing some additional patients to access coverage in our community and around the state. As a matter of fact, about 600,000 new people will have access to health care as a result of some of the actions of our state delegation. So it's a big thing. It also improves the health and lives of individuals going forward.
Very good, thank you. Angel, a quick question for you. You've had enormous growth. Dole has been growing. They're an international company. They're getting more international every day. Love to hear a little bit about what's going on as you bolted on and continue to grow through acquisition. Can you talk a little bit about maybe strategy and what's emerging at Dole?
Right now, Total Produce, who's a global permanent fresh vegetable company out of Ireland, purchased Dole back in 2021. And combining these two companies have really helped us enhance our presence in the market. Now recently, back in January of 2023, Dole announced that it's going to sell its fresh Dole division to Fresh Express. Now, that is a direction that strategic direction that the company's taking. Now, because we're still in the process of the agreement by the U.S. Department of Justice, I can't comment too much on the specifics, but I do have to mention that we have not seen a negative impact whatsoever in Bessemer City, although we have been through these acquisitions throughout the year. To mention, last year, the company continues to invest. Right now, last year in October 2022, we expanded our trays and bags produce, tray mix, to incorporate our ready-to-eat salad bowl. That has strengthened our customer base. They continue to inject capital into Bessemer City. Right now we have 567 workers, 57 of which are salary. 8.6% of our workers live in Bessemer City. So we have a strong presence in the market. Right now, we have invested in the last 3 years millions of dollars just in Bessemer City expanding. As I mentioned, we started our ready-to-eat bowl. We are the only facility in the East Coast for Dole that produces these salad bowls. Right now we have major wholesalers like Walmart, Aldi, Lidl, Apple, and they are super confident in our performance here in Dole. And right now our facility is only producing at 85%. So we have the opportunity to continue to expand within our current footprint, and we're located in the perfect market to really expand the business here in Gaston County.
Very good, thank you. Faison. Yes, sir. Lots going on. You've been doing a few things here on Main Street, right?
Yes.
So, you're working? Well, now you have to share.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Hear you loud and clear.
All right, very good. Well, you have a regional overlay. You're all over the Charlotte region.
Yes.
You made a bold, some would say pioneering move, and I don't think it was pioneering. I think you're ready, right, to grow here in Gaston County. I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts about the experience of where you've been, the process of working here in Gaston County relative, maybe you don't have to be specific if you don't like doing some of the other counties, but the pro-business attitude and maybe what you see on the horizon for Gaston County.
Great question. Good morning, or I guess it's still morning. Glad to be here. My name is Gaston County. I'm the CEO of Gaston Companies. As John mentioned, we are regional. We operate in both North and South Carolina. We actually are involved in about 7 different markets. How did we get here? About 2 years ago, our company, we do a lot of stuff. We develop, manage, lease, broker. But one of our hallmarks is we learned years ago that one of the best market moves is to find markets that are growth markets. But rather than go into the suburbs, which we've done over the years, we go into the center cities. And the reason is, we've learned that if you can build in the center city, you have the attraction of the amenity package being the backyard of the city. So we don't need to build swim pools, tennis courts, whatever. So we look for cities like Gaston and others. We're in Boone, we're in Pinehurst, we're in Southern Pines, we're in Fort Mill, we're in Rock Hill. But several years ago, along those lines, we kept getting a call from Christy. Is Christy here? Stand up, Christy. Christy bugged us to death. She called us and called us and said, "Face it, you gotta get over here. I've got a great site." So we said, "All right, we'll take a drive. Get over here." And we looked and she said, "I've got a great site, which is right behind this wall, Center City Crossing." And we said, "All right, we wouldn't have done it without the focus of Christy and her team. But more importantly, the key factor for us is we do not want to go into markets that are anti-growth. We don't want to fight with mayors, city council, city managers. We want to be embraced. And I can tell you without a doubt that this city manager, the mayor, the entire council has been nothing but fantastic. And so that was a huge difference. We don't want to fight. What we do is do our develop. This deal is a $20 million project, 90 units. So the entire city and the leadership has been fantastic. And so that's, otherwise wouldn't be here, but it's been great. And we're 80% completed, opening up February 1st. So we're excited to be here.
And I think you mentioned pre-leasing's it's going really well.
We've got about 15, 20 already on the list. We would expect to be fully leased in 6 to 8 months. And pretty high rents. What Sophia mentioned is it helps us when the housing market gets tight, then that helps us as far as rental, that they move to rents. And this market needed a place like Center City, and so it's being received very well. We've got 6 floors, 90 units, 1, 2, 3 bedrooms, rooftop bar, and a lounge. You've got the best views in the city on that roof. So, yes.
Thank you, Faison. Well, just a sidebar, Christy told me before that she has at least 2 more spots for you to take a look at here. And there's more expansion.
We're always looking.
Okay.
Depends on the price.
So, Sophia, I know you talked a little bit about the economy, and you have scope that maybe none of us really have. You're all over, well, some of you have, but you're all over the country. And you were in New Orleans yesterday, and we're so fortunate to have you, and you have scope around North Carolina, South Carolina. We're a business-friendly state. South Carolina is a business-friendly state. We're continuing to grow. How do you think, and you're coming from New York, you see a different business climate, and this is not a lot, but what do you see the difference? What do you see from business economic environments? I mean, what do you see in relative, because we do have a lot of people, like, you're not an anomaly, you're from New York. There's a few people here from New York.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear.
No, it's a great question, and it's one of the most interesting ones, right? I'm based in New York, I'm from New York. I work for a bank based in Memphis. Everyone's like, how? It's a long story, but actually not that long. It's a W&L connection, right? What do you know? Virginia, based in Southern Bank. But it's been really interesting in the last couple of years because obviously our bank's footprint is entirely in the Southeast, right? So I spend a lot of time in the Southeast. the Southeast has obviously, you guys are not aware of this, seen a huge population migration from places like New York, California. And so in terms of sort of the business outlook, right, a lot of it baseline does come down to demographics, right? Where there are more people and there is more need, there is more need for business and growth. And so it's been an interesting time to sort of look at the economy, right? And one thing I often get asked is, are there places that are sort of sheltered if we do have a downturn? And places like this are, I mean, no one's gonna be sheltered, but there are better sort of underlying fundamentals in part because of basic demographics. And so it has been an interesting time to be in the South and be in the markets, right? Where I'll be telling a story of something going on in the economy and I'm in a market and someone goes, yeah, we're not feeling that slowdown at all, right? We're in the opposite, right? When supply chains were improving, nationally, I still heard a lot of, not here, we still can't get the things we need. And so I think, again, there's more pain points, but there's also more opportunity. In terms of New York's a wild place, right? I won't tell you how much I pay in rent at all, and I do not have a roof deck. And so, you know, I think the business environment in New York is just always cutthroat and expensive. I haven't ever been anywhere in New York where someone's gone, wow, yeah, the town has been really supportive of our growth. My dad is actually in commercial real estate, and I didn't hear of any easy battles. So I think those are probably the biggest difference. But really what it basically, on a very, very basic level, the demographic shift that we have seen in the last 3 years that I am seeing absolutely no sign of reversing, right? There was a big question, are people gonna go back to where they came from? No, people have realized that quality of life is kind of nice in a lot of these places, and especially as you're having this development that supports the next generation, right? People who maybe don't want to live in a home or can't afford to and want an amenity and want services and want, you know, made-to-go salads and not fine dining. As you see sort of the whole economy shift, I think that that's a really, really good thing for the future growth.
Thank you, Sophia, appreciate that. Just had to throw a New York thing in there. Chris,
Proud.
There you go. I'm gonna throw a little lob to you, right? Because you've been doing a little bit of rap about workforce development. I've known you for, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years, and that's all we've ever talked about, right? So, can you talk a little bit about, you have nursing shortages, different things going on, a little bit about what CaroMont strategy is in the region? How are you gonna fix that? Because you're gonna have to fix it, right, yourself, right, for the most part, right?
Right, great question, John. The great leadership, like people sitting in this room, you're often trying to see what you need before you need it. And you try to anticipate, okay, what I have today might not be what I need tomorrow. And that is our job, that's our responsibility. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. Either by luck or providence, or hopefully a little bit of both, you know, about 6 years ago, before we started actually having a crisis of staffing, I had the opportunity to reach out to the then school superintendent, Dr. Jeff Booker, and we sat down and had a conversation. I said, Dr. Booker, we'd love to start creating a pipeline for your talent, your students, to come into the healthcare space. And this was at a time that we were staffed fine. And you know, going back to what you just said, I said, to have people in this community that says, you know, it wasn't a matter of, well, nah, we're kind of busy, we got things going on. It's a matter of, what do you need and how do we do it? And we did it, and we started with a CaroMont Health Sciences Academy over at East Gaston High School, where any student in the county, they made available to say, if you want to go into healthcare, we've got basically a focused academy going here. Following that, we had conversations with Dr. Hoosier, Dr. Thierfelder over at Belmont Abbey. I tell the story frequently. The hospital that you pass going on I-85 that's coming out of the ground on Belmont Abbey's campus was born in a booth at the Outback on New Hope Road. Because Dr. Thierfelder and I sat down and said, you know, what can we do together? You're the only four-year institution we have in this location, in this community. What can we do together? And so we started talking. I said, well, what about if we build a hospital on your campus? And he's like, why don't we do that? So we, you know, it kind of, you know, a lot of things transpired, but we kind of went from there. And so the pipeline kind of contributed now to that momentum, the state coming in and saying to Gaston College, hey guys, we see what you're doing in this community. we're gonna give you $60 million to build a health sciences facility at Gaston Community College. That's unprecedented in the state of North Carolina. That didn't happen. Had there not been those partnerships of this community saying, yes, we want to help each other solve problems, create pathways for students that might not have access to great education, great healthcare, and great jobs, great paying jobs, if we had just kind of all stayed in our silos, that wouldn't be happening. There would not be a $60 million investment coming from the state back to this community had those seeds not been planted prior to the need really getting intense. Now, that's certainly not to say that we have all the talent we need, but part of what Gaston is going to do with this investment is to build something that is adaptive to what the future might be, that we are predicting, like what Sophia's giving us today. Where are we going? Where do we think we're going to need to be? What's the talent are we going to need to have in this community? And I say it quite frequently. We are proud of the fact that we're an independent, community-based hospital system. Very proud of that fact. But independence does not mean alone. You cannot be successful alone. So I encourage you, the lesson learned from this, not just for workforce development, but the people that are sitting around you today probably have some solutions to some of the challenges that you're facing. It's just a matter of making those connections, getting that momentum together, and guess what? When I win, you win, and it's vice versa.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Could I piggyback on that real
Sure,
quick?
yeah.
I do want to acknowledge Gaston County. In 2022, they provided a grant for economic workforce development. That grant has helped us with retention, because as you develop the workforce, there's a skin in the game for employees, right? One thing that motivates people, in my opinion, is the ability to move up within the company. Out of that grant, we have promoted upward of 9 to 10 hourly workforce employees to key roles, manager positions, production supervisors, maintenance supervisors, quality assurance. So most of our employees, when you look at what we pay, although it's comparable with the labor market, they don't come into our workforce with any type of education background. So the fact that we at Dole take that as the top of the agenda to develop the workforce, it's amazing. The fact that we have colleges like Gaston County and the support from the community, I think people can see the value that it brings to work for companies like Dole and CaroMont and everybody else.
That's great. It's pro-business, right? Pro-business, trying to get things done here in the community. I think one other question I would ask would be, as you continue growth, you're at 85% capacity, you have more growth opportunity, as you said, how do you balance that with technology, automation versus people? I hear, Sophia and I hear every day about AI and technology, it's where beyond. Cognitive AI is right? Yeah. But how do you balance that, and what are your thoughts for future growth here at Bessemer City?
I think for us in manufacturing, the biggest challenges with labor is the fact that after COVID, we saw a shift in where work-life balance became the top of the list for a lot of our employees. And that's been a challenge that has created for us, at least in manufacturing, labor shortages and also a war for talent amongst the industries. So automation and technology, I think we have to embrace it. I don't think it's here to replace people. In manufacturing, there's always going to be that percentage of workforce that we don't have. Our turnover, because of our environment, cold and wet, is a revolving door. We always have that percentage of employees that we're missing. So we started to invest in technology, for example, to a palletizer robot, and where it could stack pallets for us. It doesn't mean that we're replacing people. It's the fact that we have right now equipment sitting idle because we don't have employees to fill these positions. So when employees ask questions like, Angel, you're bringing in, this technology, what's going on? Am I going to lose my job? I said, no, it's going to enhance long-term compensation for you, because as we continue to increase capacity, that gives us the opportunity to continue to develop you and also increase wages. So it has to be embraced. I think there has to be some sort of connection, because right now labor shortages are not going to get any better, in my opinion.
Thank you, appreciate that. And that seems to be echoed statement through a lot of our manufacturers. They're trying to get the talent, trying to do things. If you can't get the people, you have to do some of the automation and do a combo of that. Faison,
Yes, sir.
good question. You know, you have a regional approach. You go across the river. Notice the river's pretty low right now.
Yeah,
A
it
little bit
is.
drought, but you go across the river and you come back and forth. 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, you would have dreamed of probably doing a major project like this in Gaston County, in Gastonia.
We're Charlotteans, we're North Carolinians. Forever, I don't think I knew how to get to Rock Hill from Charlotte. In all due respect. We've been in business 45 years. We've seen tremendous growth, whether it's crossing the river into South Carolina or crossing the river going west into beautiful Gastonia. So it's game changer. The markets, what I call the metro market, Charlotte Metro, Gastonia, is huge. I mean, Charlotte is the 16th largest city in the country. Gastonia is booming. I mean, it really is booming. Hospital situation, workforce housing, that is our one issue that we're facing every week in our company. We're heavily involved in working with First Health. I know Chris knows First Health, great operation in serving Moore County, Pinehurst, Southern Pines, and everything. They have a huge crisis in housing. And with workforce housing, it's tricky because when you evoke the name of workforce housing, you're thinking, well, we got employees who aren't making that much money, and so we have to be careful with median income and the rents. Well, that's a hard deal for us when there's inflation, the land is expensive, construction prices ain't going down. So it's hard for us to equate helping people like Chris and First Health. We're heavily involved with Appalachian Healthcare, which is now UNC, and they have a huge crisis, and we're trying to help them in areas like Banner Elk, Newland, great communities, with no housing. And so when they bring in these nurses, they're saying, where can we live? We're not making $100,000 a year, even young doctors. And so that is a huge ongoing crisis because the major hospitals, of which CaroMont is one, First Health, blah, 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 all of them have the same problem, is employee housing. Where do they go? Will the hospitals subsidize their rents, because the rents can only go so low. We're not developing Section 8 housing. This is nice, affordable, not like Center City Crossing, but nevertheless expensive. So I think as a whole, the country has a huge crisis that we need to get our hands around and fix. And I don't think anybody has the answer yet, but it's going to be coming together with bankers and lenders and contractors to put forth the best plan we can find that works with all concerned.
Thank you for that. I was just from a banking perspective. There's a huge opportunity in the market for CRA lending. We're looking for projects. We are actively looking for projects, right? So, but most banks are. We have to do the right thing, right? We got to find a project to do, right? So, but thank you for that. I appreciate that. Sophia, question for you in regards to in Gaston County specific, and you might know this, you might not. We have a big lithium deposits and different types of businesses with Piedmont Lithium, Albemarle, other folks that have big projects for where that's going. We've seen a shift of many announcements in the last couple of years. Part of the reason the strikes are going on in the Midwest. Where do you see this shaking out? Is there a population change because of auto plants all going to move down south? I mean, what do you see? Because you have a little bit of scope on that.
Yeah. Well, I think that the biggest, someone sort of touched on this, one of the biggest changes is employees' sort of feelings towards work in the last couple of years, right? And it's a weirdly not hard data series, right? Honestly, in economics, it's my favorite part. It's the human psychology part, and it's the part that you can't really explain until it's happening, right? You mentioned this work-life balance. it's something that people have, it's just shifted in the workforce after, we survived a pandemic and people have shifted, and this, the whole notion of remote work really didn't exist, and all of this sort of change in the labor force has a really big impact in where people work, how they want to work. And so I think that you're going to continue to see that, right? I'm personally a believer that we're never going back to the way we all were as workers, right? I think that things have fundamentally shifted, particularly this next generation that's coming up, they graduated in COVID and all of those things. They have a very different perspective on how they want to work and what they want to do. I don't think we're going to be in this weird limbo forever, right? I do think flexible work, if you work in a sort of corporate job, is going to be the norm. Maybe 4 days you're in the office and 1 you're not, right? And that's a shift in office space. I think in terms of sort of, healthcare, I know has been super stressed, overworked and understaffed, and it's so hard, and the housing issue, and the same in manufacturing. And longer term, we are looking at an aging population, right? So technology has to be a factor. I think the way you said it as a complement, not a replacement, is entirely true, right? You look at the economy, we have had several years of really strong growth, and we haven't had the labor force we need, which suggests that people have been innovative. It's one of the benefits, I think, of times of stress is that it forces people to innovate, and so I think that is sort of where we all need to keep going and thinking is, right, how do you harness technology to be a complement and not something scary and a replacement? And we talk about all the time, right, we're in banking. AI is, I asked ChatGPT, what's the Fed gonna do? And it was like, I will not give you financial advice. And I was like, job is safe. But there are other ways that I could harness it, I think, that would be helpful. And so I think we're all at this weird sort of crux where we do have to think about both things at the same time, just because also like humans have shifted. But you mentioned something, Chris, that I think is great. It's the ecosystem, right? It's the asking for help and where when people have strengths that you don't, that I think really keep communities strong as well and businesses going.
Thank you, Sophia. I put you on the spot on that.
No,
That's a highly political topic.
No, I'm good. Listen, I'm here for a good question.
Well, finish up with the moderation before they open up the questions, but I really would like to understand from each one of you, what is most important, the most important point that you get across today about your organization and what you feel most excited about in Gaston County? And I guess for Sophia, maybe what you feel most excited about, wherever you want to talk about.
I'll just kick off. No, I would just say I'm gonna give a pitch for First Horizon. I think I'm most excited. I feel very, very fortunate to work in the job I do, and this is my favorite part of the job. I have no idea what my hotel room number is ever, but it's worth it because actually getting to hear from all of you and hear from people that are the economy is so incredibly valuable to me, right? I look at data, I read news, but you guys actually know what's going on, and so I'm very grateful to be part of an organization that is involved in the communities that they're in, and that brings me into them. So that's my pitch for myself.
Pretty good, thank you.
Again, for us, it's absolute total cooperation. We receive from city manager, the mayor, city council, and the economic development group. Without that support, we wouldn't be here. We would keep looking and finding a place that is, I would use the phrase developer friendly in a kind of positive way. Most development we think is good. There's some that's not. It all depends on how you approach it, but we love Gaston County. Gaston has been great. Their door's been open to us, and we appreciate it as the city manager. And we love it here. We hope to do more than just this one project, although this has got my total attention right now, so big. But the city, the leadership is critical for developers and real estate people. So I want to thank all of you for your interest in what we're doing.
Thank you, sir. Angel?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that when we have meetings and settings like this, it gives us all an opportunity to kind of piggyback on the challenges that we all have in the industry. The fact that now we are working closer with the GBA, and the fact that we have the talent pipeline, we're working with Gaston County to kind of understand what are the challenges, what can we do to continue to attract people to Gaston. All right, right now we have positions that sometimes we have to source out from Charlotte and other states. But the fact that the community is growing, the fact that we have neighbors being built right there in where we are located, the distribution, we have new manufacturing company coming in, all that is exciting. I think the more we could continue to build on housing, I think that's a very topic, and where sometimes people don't know where to live when they come down to Bessemer City. The fact that we have the ballpark here in Gaston County, people are noticing the change in Gaston County. The fact that we're getting out to the GBA and the talent pipeline, right? Understanding what the needs are and how can we tailor to that work-life balance. And I think, again, incorporating the technology is gonna help us alleviate some of that and give back to employees maybe that work-life balance, right? Increased capacity will help also reduce the amount of days we have to work. So the fact that we have group settings like this and we have business leaders really understanding what the challenges are crucial for any company to succeed in Gaston County.
Very good, sir. Thank you. Chris?
Well, I'll try to complement or capstone the data nerd morning we've had so far with at least some data from our perspective in healthcare. From CaroMont Health, year over year, last year we grew admissions by 5.8%, births by 6.2%. Our ED volume, which was already the 5th busiest in the state, grew by 1.5%. Outpatient surgeries grew by 12.8%. Those are just a few, not that I pay attention to numbers. But that is somewhat of an indication. Healthcare, the numbers in healthcare, again, I'm playing fake economist. They do have some reflection of the growth in the community, right? The demand for healthcare is a direct output of our growth, our activity, and what's happening in our community. It's the very reason that a few years back, we committed to over $400 million in capital investment in our primary service area, which is centered right here in Gastonia. We would not do that if we were not bullish on what's happening here and what we believe the future looks like. And I think the state validated that with the investment that they made from the state budget.
Very good, sir. Thank you. If we can, before we turn over, I think Steve's going to do some moderation or some questions. Can you give our panelists a round of applause?
Thank you, John, for moderating. We have about 10 minutes for questions in the audience for any of our panelists. So, any questions from our panelists?
Can I ask a question of you guys? I'm gonna ask a question.
Thank you for
Okay.
making this
No,
not
it's good.
awkward.
No, I just have one question. I'm always interested. What would you say, because I'm collecting data up here, right? What would you say is your biggest pain point business-wise right now? And what do you think is your biggest opportunity?
There's no question for us is the cost of construction. We fight two battles. One is the cost of money. One is the cost of construction. We can handle movement in the interest rates as long as they don't go nuts. But we can't, for example, it's costing us anywhere from $350 to $400 a foot on most of our construction. Think about that. That's huge. And so clearly, it's cost of construction. Material is out the roof. We're seeing no moderation, which I'm surprised in those numbers. What's the second?
Opportunity or growth?
Oh, I'm here. I'm here.
The biggest challenge for us is that with automation, the return on investment is not quick enough for us. Right now, although we are big, we are a business of pennies when it comes to salads, right? There's only so much you can charge for a bag of salad. So the challenge for us is that most of this automation is extremely expensive. Right now, we have inflation, challenges with the supply chain. A lot of our new equipment comes from overseas. So sourcing those parts has been a challenge for us. So we are working to source local vendors that could help us provide those parts for us. And I think that's gonna be a big opportunity. I think it's gonna help give and leave that money here in Gaston County versus shipping it overseas. So right now, we're working close with our procurement department to see how we can continue to source more locally instead of going overseas.
I think ours will be no surprise. Supplying cost of labor is a big deal for us. On the operational front, and of course, with the way healthcare is reimbursed, it's capitated, because basically, if you're insured, it's a negotiated rate, you're not really the payer, and so our rates do not change with them. We get paid the same regardless of whether labor rates have tripled. So you're still receiving the same revenue. I can't change prices. In other words, so it's price fixed. So that's a big challenge when you have rising costs and the inability, the elasticity of being able to actually change your prices. So that's a challenge for us. We also experienced some pretty big challenges in supply chain. Building the second hospital. We were scheduled actually to open that facility probably late this year. It's pushed until late next year, simply because of electrical components that were on about a 56-week waiting period for those. So that's been an interesting and unforeseen challenge. But if you're trying to get a switch gear today, it'll be 2 years. So if you need one, you might want to get in line. So that's been an interesting experience. But with regard to our greatest opportunity, we are fortunate to be in what you mentioned is a lot of migration, a lot of growth coming to this area. So with population growth, there's obviously market share growth for us.
We have a question here on the left.
Thanks. I hear a lot about automation, and you touched on AI for a moment. I've been using it for a while. We even had a presentation about using AI in our plant. It's early. We want to be an early adopter. Maybe to go back to Chris on this, or the whole panel would be, we haven't really talked and dove in or whatever to AI. So how do you see it impacting your medical side or our services? I've heard it, reporting and everything else. I'll give it back to you.
Yeah,
How do
absolutely.
you see AI?
It's a real thing. It's not a fad. It's not going away. With the healthcare delivery is going to change in the next decade pretty dramatically. You've got a number of disruptors, particularly on the retail side, where they're going to try to commoditize healthcare. Now, that's going to be an interesting observation, because the level of training required for physicians is not easy to commoditize. And so now you've got big box entrants, you've got your Amazons, your Walmarts that are getting into the retail side to try to deliver certain portions of healthcare. I'm not anticipating anyone having heart surgery done on their kitchen table anytime soon, or at least I probably wouldn't advise it. But there may be other components that will be delivered differently. Where AI will impact, I think there's opportunities. Some of the burden on physicians and providers right now, there's tremendous documentation burden. In other words, they have to spend a whole lot more time writing down what they did with you than the time they spent with you. And that is regulatory, reimbursement, all of those are impacted by that. I think there's an opportunity for AI to potentially impact that and change that dramatically. Now, if you look long into the future, there may be some things where AI actually is looking at charts, looking at, testing, those type things, and actually making determinations and making recommendations back to the physicians, and or even replacing in some cases that, but hopefully that's a long time down the road and not when I need them. But AI will be a real thing in healthcare. How we use it, how we harness it to support better outcomes, because at the end of the day, our mission is truly about better patient outcomes, not just about more efficient getting you through. Certainly we have to be efficient, but it really is about improving your lives and your health outcomes.
Sophia.
Yes.
Here's your challenge.
Okay.
You have 9 minutes before a hard stop for you, and you're a long talker, and I have a big question. So this is the macro.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the economy right now, looking out a couple of years. I continue to be unnerved by this national debt issue we have, and generations to come. What does that mean? Can you help us frame, and I know it's a challenge on time.
Yes.
But just help us broadly on what is going on with that?
Yeah, I was about to say, I hope you're not asking me to help you solve it, because I am intentionally not in politics. It is without a doubt a concern. One thing that I find interesting, I watch a lot of market data, is right in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of attention on the federal deficit, not necessarily right now, but the sort of unsustainable path that we're on. And to me, the way markets are suddenly reacting is very interesting because it's not news. We have been on an unsustainable fiscal path for a while, and particularly with projecting out, right? We have an aging population, which we absolutely know comes with higher costs of healthcare, higher costs of government subsidies, right? And we know that we have a smaller population coming in to support it. And so it's an interesting dynamic that it's suddenly come to the forefront of everyone's sort of mind. The other reality is that the government is not immune from higher interest rates, right? Everyone, I think, forgot that until most recently. It was like, wait a second, they also have to borrow at higher costs. And so that's a really big concern when we're thinking about it. It is a reality. It is exactly like an aging population, right? We knew it was coming, and yet we're all suddenly going, well, hopefully not everyone, but a lot of people in markets are going, oh, wow, right? It's like when people retired in the pandemic, people were like, oh, wow. It's math. That being said, what do I think is the answer? And I won't get too political, but I will say that one of the biggest concerns and one of the reasons why people are concerned is just the reality that it is not being dealt with. Right, we have seen it already, twice this year, that we've come very, very close to a government shutdown, and we're heading towards potentially a third time. And so it is absolutely not a political comment, it is just I always think if the government was a business, would we lend to them? Not the way they run their balance sheet right now, right? And so the only thing I can say is it is out of my hands, but it is absolutely a concern, and it is a long-term reality that we know we are facing as a nation that we have to think about. And when we're thinking about sort of the bigger economic picture, it means we're gonna have to rely on technology because we don't have a labor force. Comprehensive immigration reform is a critical part of this country's economic growth. And so there are a lot of big picture items that are really, really important and that play a factor. And again, thankfully it's out of my hands, but talk to your elected officials, please. But it definitely is a concern. But it is one that I said, I'm like, what did everyone just wake up last week and realize it? We have been on this path for a while, and we need to be, as a country, more aware of it, which hopefully is where we're headed.
Thank you for that, and thanks to all the panelists for a great conversation. And I also want to thank again our sponsors. So CaroMont for the overall program today, and of course First Horizon and Sophia, and then also Duke Energy and ICS. So I asked the question, one, to test Sophia to see if she could take her penchant for talking and talk about a big issue shortly. But really, it's to emphasize the voice of business matters. National debt's a huge issue, yes, but we can't just rely on somebody somewhere to fix it. If these issues are going to impact us, and to Chris Peake's point, looking ahead, we don't have to look too far into the future where this is going to impact business. So the GBA is bringing people together to bring that collective voice of business so we can talk to elected officials. So I know the speaker and the senator had to leave, but those guys will tell you, as the rest of our delegation, even our federal delegation, if they don't hear from us what the issues are, they don't know how to focus their work. So I encourage you to continue to participate in what the GBA has to offer. Give us your perspective on how we can do this better. But we really do want to align on the advocacy effort more strongly next year so that we can get ahead of some of these really, really big and important issues that are going to directly affect you and your business and your employees. So one opportunity coming up, one more one, till we wrap up the year, is our annual event in December, on December 8th. That will be here in the conference center, and this is a chance to really celebrate a great year's worth of work and effort for the GBA and really the whole business community here in Gaston County. So, you got 4 minutes. We'll give you 4 minutes. Thanks for being here today. Appreciate it. Thank you again to the panelists and Sophia.
Sally, good to see you. Good to see you.